91% of how long and how healthy we live is due to epigenetics, our environment, which you've talked, so eloquently about for a long time. So it's not just one thing, like you said. We're not saying like this causes that. It is we are living under, like, our modern life, modernity is like a proverbial stress test, and it's not just one thing. And it's like the analogy that I think of that works good in this scenario is we have different buckets. Like that's your bio-individual threshold for stressors.
Welcome back to Take Back Your Health with Dr. Amy Myers. Today's guest is Dr. Will Cole, a leading functional medicine expert who consults with people around the globe, starting one of the first functional medicine telehealth centers in the world over a decade ago. He was named one of the top 50 functional and integrative doctors in the nation. Dr. Will Cole provides a functional medicine approach for those with thyroid issues, autoimmune, hormone imbalances, digestive disorders, and brain problems. He is also the host of the popular The Art of Wellbeing podcast and the New York Times bestselling author of Intuitive Fasting, Ketotarian, The Inflammation Spectrum and Gut Feelings, Healing the Shame-Fueled Relationship Between You and What You Eat and How You Feel. Welcome, Will. So happy to have you on Take Back Your Health. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Take Back Your Health with Dr. Amy Myers. Today's guest is a dear old friend. We go back, well, I don't know how many years, but, way back is Dr. Will Cole. So welcome, Will. How are you?
Thank you. I know it's like time is a vapor, right? And you look back, and especially, as a parent and also professionally, the cliche of like the days are long, but the years are short. That works both as parents and professionally. You look back and like, what? That I'm so busy, but time is just flying by.
Time is flying by. And you and I have been around since, sort of the beginning, and we've seen the times change, and not to date this podcast, but we are post-election day. So we'll see if actually some other changes take place regarding health and functional medicine and getting to the root cause. And I know you were one of the big proponents,
Mm.
storming the Kellogg's Capitol, talking about food dyes. So
I thought of October, and the date I find, again, this is completely different. I'm not equating the two, but the day we were at the rally in Kellogg's, and the way that Kellogg's kind of handled it was sort of this, someone put a sign out in the window that said, get off our lawn. And we was just like a bunch of kids and parents, like just peacefully protesting out. I thought of the storming of the Versailles in October, where people, and Maria Antoinette and King Louis were kind of, it's just not very sensitive to the people. And this is kind of the same thing. The titans of American culture is big food and the pharmaceutical industries, and people, I think, are waking up that we need to do something different to see something different. And I think it should be like, I think the big food and pharmaceutical industry, we can have a beautiful both and, not either or approach, but we have to change. We have to evolve, right? And all we were asking for there with Kellogg's was just that the cereals were the same like any other country.
Right.
It's like artificial dyes and preservatives like BHT aren't used in other countries. So we just want the same as anybody else.
Yeah, I'm going to go a little rogue here because I wasn't even planning to talk about this. But, I just kind of took a different philosophy. And, my child doesn't eat cereal. She just isn't really into it. And so, I usually take a stand on things that I have a personal conviction about. I mean, we protein, eggs, actually she intermittent fasts, as do I generally. So we're generally not eating breakfast, but if she does, it's, eggs and sausage or a smoothie or something. And so, I do think it's important, and we should be, treated as any other country. But, what I found was kind of interesting is that I shouldn't say nobody. I didn't see a lot of people just saying like, don't eat cereal. I understand, you and I perhaps were more educated on this topic than other people, perhaps, have the financial means that we can opt for the healthier cereal should we choose to do that doesn't have these ingredients. And I certainly understand that there are people who don't, even know that this is happening, or they don't have the financial resources. And so they, have to opt for these cheaper foods. But I just didn't see anybody in that conversation talking about, well, why don't we just not eat cereal at all?
Yeah.
Like, it's not really, none of the cereals, even like the healthier ones that don't have the food dye and stuff, it's still just a bunch of processed grains.
Totally.
They're not organic. And so, because we had to reschedule this interview, I have some, issues. My sister has stage 4 cancer. And so I just didn't get on into the conversation because I was, involved in that. But,
Right.
I didn't see a lot of conversation about like just not eating cereal to begin with.
No, and that, some of us mentioned it there when we were there because we know that. I mean, it's like none of us that were talking actually eat any cereal other than this a few good brands that I do love as options. But like, yeah, I personally don't eat cereal. But we were there to as I think it's symbolic of a bigger problem, right? It's like we have these ingredients that are still in our food supply. But also, like you said, not everybody's going to be a health aficionado or even interested in this stuff. So the people that are in middle America that are interested in health, or people that are in food deserts that are marketed to with these addictive foods, there's always going to be consumers of Fruit Loops, right? And or other cereals like that. And why are we like? Can we just start with? We're starting with one toxic ingredient at a time, and we're going to start with the one that requires a warning label in other countries, and then we'll go to the other ingredients too after that. You have to come to the next one. I want you there.
Right. Okay, happy to come. And, the same week, I don't know your thoughts on this or anything, but, the Pfizer papers, by Naomi Wolf was released, and it was just a whole nother thing. Like, we have a choice, or most people do, whether to consume cereal or not. However, many people, you and I work for ourselves, so we had a choice, and I assume you made a choice. I allowed a choice for my team, whether they wanted to get vaccinated or not, but a lot of people didn't have a choice. Yeah. And, I think the harm that is coming from, frankly, the cover-up that was happening with the COVID vaccines is way more impactful. My sister's was a conventional nurse and, had multiple vaccines and boosters. And I never think that anything is one reason, right? I mean, because there are plenty of people that had multiple vaccines and, at least so far on the surface, nothing has happened to them. But, it's all this confluence of events and underlying inflammation and gut and all of the things. So I by no means am saying that, that there's a one-to-one correlation, but the research is starting to come out, right? About, I was reading this one paper about IgG4 being extremely elevated, and just getting a second booster, increase your IgG4 by 38-fold, and, getting a natural infection to COVID with the spike protein, did not increase or even increase IgG4 at all. Which is a very inflammatory marker, and how it's associated with cancer is that it's turning off certain enzymes, the GALT enzyme that basically is running around looking for these cancer cells and would go in and destroy them. So anyway, it was just kind of like, there was first I want to say, I'm I really appreciate you guys standing up, and, there was so much media around this, and that was incredible. And there's this other thing, the Pfizer papers, which for those people that don't know, is they wanted to suppress this research for 75 years, and they were unable to do that. And then she got over 3,000 volunteers of scientists to comb through millions of documents. And then they basically distilled it into a book. And now I see she has the Moderna papers coming out as well. Yeah. But,
it's complete. Like, those are also the people that were throwing around words like misinformation, but all the people that were talking
misinformation,
largely, what was called misinformation was actually the truth, and the truth, quote unquote, is actually misinformation. It's the Orwellian doublespeak, right? Intent on distorting the truth. It's absolutely true. As someone, you and I, like, we live and breathe this stuff. You can't really spend your time helping people with autoimmune conditions heal and not talk. You have to be okay with bioindividuality, and you have to be okay with, yes, some people's systems are more sensitive than others. And then people were losing their jobs over mandates. there was no pro-choice in this. People were forced to, or they would lose their livelihood. So yeah, it was criminal. It was actually criminal to be sold something that was said was completely safe, which, most of us knew, okay, there's no such thing really as safe. It's just, what are the risks and what are the rewards? And they were told it was completely safe. And we were also told that we were not going to get COVID if we got the shot. And it wasn't the case at all, right? I mean, people still got COVID. And we also would say, yeah, it would decrease spread. And, it's really was cherry-picked data, suppressed data. And I think in hindsight, we're going to look at this time in American history and really be, hopefully learn from it, that we want freedom of information. We want transparency. We want choice. We want true, democracy in our country.
Yeah. And I mean, look, we'll see, what we get, but, certainly, it's just, again, I appreciate you guys storming the Capitol. I wish there were more people not storming the Capitol, storming the headquarters of Kellogg's, but I wish there were more people sort of storming the Capitol, not like January 6th, really demanding now that these books are out about, the vaccines and the real story about COVID to say, this is the real tragedy. I mean, many people, you can choose whether to eat cereal or not for most people. Yep. But, most people did not get a choice about whether they were going to be vaccinated. No. Well, at the end of all of this, or perhaps at the beginning of all of this, if you're eating this cereal or if you were, getting multiple vaccines and boosted, becomes inflammation. So I know you are the king of inflammation and an expert on autoimmunity, as am I. And so let's dive into that. So why can some people eat all these food dyes and crap cereal or, get COVID or get a COVID vaccine, and some people be okay and other people, it's an utter disaster?
Yeah, well, it's that the research that I think explains it the best are the researchers that look at it in the lens of ancestral health and are looking at this crosstalk between epigenetics, genetics, and depending on the study that you cite that's looking at genetics and epigenetics, it's anywhere between 77, I think, is the lowest, like 91% of how long and how healthy we live is due to epigenetics, our environment, which you've talked, so eloquently about for a long time. So it's not just one thing, like you said. We're not saying like this causes that. It is we are living under, like, our modern life, modernity is like a proverbial stress test, and it's not just one thing. And it's like the analogy that I think of that works good in this scenario is we have different buckets. Like, that's your bio-individual threshold for stressors. Some people have big buckets. There's blessed, beautiful people. And then some smaller buckets. And a lot of people that we talk about, maybe even ourselves, we tend to have like the medium to smaller buckets. And it could be things like, what determines the bucket size are things like methylation gene variants, HLA gene variants, detoxification gene variants, endocannabinoid gene variants. So like the more gene variants you have makes your body slower at detoxing, slower at methylating, more prone to being sensitive and hypervigilant, an inflammatory response to an environmental toxin, a virus or a mold or something like that, or chronic stress, trauma, whatever. And the smaller your bucket, the easier it's going to be filled up. What fills up the bucket are the foods we're eating, or the foods we're not eating, environmental toxins, chronic stress, unresolved trauma, nutrient deficiencies. So that's kind of why you see such a difference, right? And we've seen this over the years where it's like, let's say the patient has responses to a moldy house and their spouse doesn't have the same gene variants that they have. And they're like, you're fine, you're a hypochondriac. Like, they mean well, they just don't get it because, like, to them, how could we both be living in the house, but they're fine, but they're not? Because they're different bucket sizes, different things within that bucket. So that's kind of my take on it and what I've seen clinically.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned a number, of these buckets. Are there ones that you see that are stronger contributors than others, or do they kind of all weigh in equally, or it really depends on the person?
Like the the genetic component, we do have a very high percentage. Like if you're looking at the actual bucket size, to use that strange analogy that I keep going to, but we see a high correlation with methylation, like more significantly higher double methylation gene variants, homozygous gene variants, MTHFR, C677T, a lot of like histamine type methylation gene variants too. And we see a very high, when we test this in patients, the specific gene variants, the haplotypes of the human leukocyte antigen, the HLA gene variants that are more, the research shows to be that people are more likely to be triggered with mold toxicity, chronic fatigue syndrome from different bacteria, viruses, and mold biotoxins. So there's a very strong genetic component of it, but it's only about a third or so of the puzzle is genetics. The majority of it is epigenetics. So if you talk about what fills up the bucket the most, I would say that food is, of course, a significant component of it because everybody's eating, at least they should be, but everybody's eating. Are we gonna eat? So it's like that's gonna be the low hanging fruit. We have to just look at optimizing that. And we live in such a weird, wild, brave new world in some ways that our microbiome and our genetics are just living in this strange land where it's like even the healthy foods for that person, it's not loving them back right now. So we're seeing food reactions that 15 years ago we weren't having. I think like every few years we're seeing people with more sensitive systems. So it's not the food's fault per se, it's what we've done to the food supply and what we've done to the human microbiome. Mm-hmm. So I think looking at the food, and then obviously inextricably linked to that is this environmental toxin piece. When you look at things like forever chemicals and microplastics and herbicides and pesticides, I mean, I really think that this is going to be, we're going to look back, if we get this right and actually turn things around, is a massive, it was so criminal what we've done to our own people with these environmental toxins.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how there are people clearly that, are not seeing the link, but I mean, it just seems like so many people, my half sister's only 31. So many young people are getting, I mean, you and I have seen this already for years, the autoimmunity, the inflammatory, processes, the chronic fatigue, the fibromyalgia in younger and younger people, right? Thyroid, thyroid disease. And now it's, moving into the cancers. And then linked with that, as we talk about just the environment in general. I mean, I don't even remember. I was just looking at the election stuff today, but there was some flood in the Midwest that killed 4 people. There's a flood in Spain, a week or so ago. Of course, the 2 recent hurricanes. I mean, the environment and looking at these natural disasters that are, happening everywhere as well.
Well, I think of that hermetic phrase of as above, so below, as within, so without. Like we are intimately connected to nature, and our gut microbiome is intimately connected to the soil microbiome. And there's climate change going on environmentally. There's physiological climate change in the form of chronic inflammation. And so it's so connected. It's so connected,
right?
That you're seeing more extreme external environmental things. There is more extreme physiological dysregulation going on a daily basis. And we just have to wake up to see that this is so spiritual, and it's on the physical plane, but it's such a spiritual relationship that we have with nature. And because we've divorced ourselves from nature, we are paying the price because our body is just like, what the heck is going on here? And our planet is saying, what the heck is going on here?
And so what can, we as individuals do to help get all of that back into balance?
Well, in my mind,
it's so overwhelming. I mean, even to somebody like me who lives and breathes this, I know the things that I do in my own life to try to control certain variables, but when you really look at it, it just feels overwhelming. So what can we as individuals do?
So I would say, if we think of that mismatch, that epigenetic genetic mismatch, this chasm between our DNA, which hasn't changed in 10,000 years, and the world around us, which has changed so much, I think what are some micro habits that we can do to start to decrease that distance between our body and our microbiome and the world around us? And it doesn't, the beautiful, I think, dichotomy of the time that we live in is while we have epidemic rises of autoimmune problems, fertility, hormonal, metabolic, other immune issues, we know more about these things than we've ever known before. Because if you look at just like our parents, grandparents, yeah, like I mean, it's worse now than it was then, but still they had environmental toxins just 1-2 generations ago, and they didn't know really anything. They was in the age of when all of this was completely like the gold standard. If someone with a white coat said it, like that was gospel, and there was still so much corruption. So I think that the beautiful silver lining in the time that we live in is the democratization of health information, the decentralization of health information, that we have conversations like this at our fingertips. Before it was like 5 channels, and you could go scour the library and find some textbook, but you really have to search. I think this is a lot more at people's fingertips. I think conversations from experts that otherwise would never have met. So I would say this, that information's a double-edged sword. Sometimes that's overwhelming because you're like, I only have so much time, I'm busy, and how do I even consume this information? So I think we had to be wise with how we're consuming information, because stressing about this stuff isn't good for our health. So I think part of it is having discerning consumption of information that is true, that's in alignment with healing, someone that has maybe expertise in getting people better, but knowing when to say no to more information. Like more information is always better. And because that can create this sort of hyper-focused obsession, stress, and anxiety around these topics, that I think we need to know when to have healthy boundaries with something that is good in certain levels, but we don't need to have it be all consuming to us. So I think that's more like a mindset and heart set around this, is I want the person to be empowered, to have agency over their health, and to make informed decisions. But I don't want them to become orthorexic and, have disordered eating or unhealthy foods and be such a ball of stress and anxiety. So I think from that mindset of like empowerment, not obsession, is a good place to start. And then from there, I mean, I think looking at the inflammatory core 4, which most of your listeners are going to know this already, so I won't spend too much time on it, but I would say looking at gluten-containing grains, industrial seed oils, looking at added sugar, looking at conventional dairy, and then if I had to plus one, it would be alcohol. But there are better for you versions of all those things, like a fermented sourdough ancient grain, or a raw dairy, or whole food sugars that, like honey, Manuka honey. I love that. So there are better for you options for all of those things that I said, other than alcohol, other than maybe getting a mocktail or something like that, like an Epidemic mocktail. So like looking how, this is another piece of advice I would say before, I stop, is don't focus on all the things you quote unquote can't have. Well, you can have whatever you want. It's that I want to shift someone's mindset again away from like this sort of dieting culture to more of like, I love my body enough to nourish it with things that love me back. And avoiding something that doesn't love me back is not restrictive, it's self-respect. And it's having that paradigm shift of, instead of being this frenetic, restrictive consciousness, it's more of like, okay, nourishment, grounding. It's self-compassion, right? So I think that goes a long way, because when you shift someone's relationship with their body and start to heal their relationship with their body and food, the food medicine is a lot more impactful, because that person's in a more of a parasympathetic state, that food that will love them back will be a lot more, it'll be a lot more effective, right? Because their body will absorb the nutrients and the body will receive it better and their digestion will be better. So I think that we have to have, in my most recent book, it was called Gut Feelings because of that, because I wanted to look at both the gut and the feelings, the physical and the mental, emotional, spiritual, because I think that both and approach is really helpful clinically that I've seen. So I think, and then we can get in the weeds with the minutia and all of that stuff with supplements and foods and things like that. But, they have great resources. I think your books are wonderful resources for people that are wanting to learn how to eat in a way that loves them back.
Right. And I think also, I talk about the autoimmune spectrum in my book. And it's like, when you're high on this spectrum, then you're really dialing it in. And when you're lower on the spectrum, you can branch out. I've personally experienced that, with patients. And then, we have no food dyes or anything in my home. And, we just passed Halloween. I have a 7-year-old. She went out, she ate some stuff and food dyes, all kind of thing. But the next day, she didn't even remember. And this has happened. She didn't even start trick-or-treating till she was 5. So we only have 2-3 years of trick-or-treating. But same thing, the thing's there. She eats what she wants that night. I literally leave it on the countertop and she completely forgets about it. And I move it into a thing. And then, whatever, while later, I just throw it out. All these other friends, she's like, Mom, the switch witch. I said, well, sweetheart, I don't know what that is because I didn't come up with that. But it's like the switch witch. I was like, that's for your friends who maybe don't know how to control eating all of this stuff. Like she's not used to it or she gets a stomach ache. But I think when you're even just moving it into children, but when you're getting so restrictive, and I experienced this growing up, not that I was that restrictive, but friends whose parents, restrictive, then they go off to college and they were just, indulged in everything. So I think also just finding that balance. Now, there are times when you might be really high on the spectrum and you do have to dial it in and you do really need to focus on every single thing that you're putting in your body. And then as you've healed, you can go and have, I'm not eating this stuff, but, I allow my child to. I figure she has way more wiggle room than I do at 55 years old, to eat something, even a standard candy, and then leave it the next day. And she gets that once a year that she's eating something really terrible.
Yeah, exactly. I know my son, I can't believe it. He's now in college. He's 18 wow. And my daughter is 15. And my son, I'm seeing a different phase of this as a parent because he's like a freshman in college and he's not at home, obviously. And he is making these decisions for himself. Like we kind of had a similar, like we did when we did Halloween, they had some, but it wasn't that big of a deal. We did do, I guess we didn't call it a switch, but they could, some years we did, I think when they were more little, they would have some of their candy. They didn't really want it, that we would be like, okay, like let's get them like a game that they want, a board game or something that they wanted. And we made it fun. But it was, like you said, it was like they had it. It wasn't a big deal. We didn't like overcorrect and create this sort of fear and anxiety around it. I never like, everyone can parent the way that they want. But I don't like, we want to make this information age appropriate. So I don't necessarily love when you get people in our space and their little kids are like, that's poison.
Right.
You're super like demonizing it to other kids. Yes, we know it's unhealthy. Yes, we know it's toxic, but I don't like preaching, like a 5-year-old preaching to, it's just like, I don't know, it doesn't sit with me well. They know it's all good for them and it's okay. They don't have to make a big deal about it. But everybody can do what they feel called to do. And it's a personal decision, but I'm seeing it now as my son make these decisions for himself. Like you said, he doesn't feel well when they go to the fried chicken place. Okay. So he will be like, he'll self-correct himself. Mm-hmm. And we want that as kids. Like he even was doing that when he was, in high school, but like, he's now definitely doing it when like there's no guardrails of us in his life on a day-to-day basis. But that's what we want. We want them to live in the real world and to know how to navigate these things and not have disordered eating around foods.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I would always tell parents, they were come in, around the like 10 to 15 years and just so worried, how am I going to do this with my child? And I thought, don't you worry. Once your child, goes through an elimination diet and then they add these things back in, or they just feel better by keeping them out, it's going to be so easy. I have she's a cousin, really. I call her my niece because it doesn't matter. I call her my niece. She's celiac and she grew up eating pasta and butter. And, then it was always having stomach aches, and realized she was celiac. And her mom was just devastated. Like, how am I going to go from this child that literally ate pasta with butter to being a celiac? And the first thing I did was send this huge package from Whole Foods. Now, it was filled with a bunch of gluten-free junk, but I just wanted them to know, like, it is possible. There are, alternatives. And of course, she's branched out and gotten healthier. But I said, don't worry about it. She is getting off this. She's going to feel so much better. She will self-regulate. I mean, and it's totally true. I mean, she won't even risk, cross-contamination, because she knows how she'll feel if she gets, the gluten.
There's agency over your health, right? Mm-hmm. And that's like that self-governance and self-agency. That is the beautiful thing to see, because it's like an intuitive, mindful, self-respect thing. It's not this list of do's and don'ts. It's like awareness, body awareness. Mm-hmm. So I agree. It's a beautiful thing. And that's why I think that art is lost when you look at like the science of it all. But the art's actually really beautiful, and somebody owns it for themselves, can heal their body and improve resilience. Like you said, even if somebody is further down on that inflammation spectrum, many times their resilience, as their gut heals, as their body heals, as we deal with the environmental toxin, a lot of food sensitivities will go away, or at least decrease in severity and frequency. So they have it here and there. The list of like negotiables, I find, will like expand, and the list of like non-negotiables will shrink, because more foods love them back, and their body is like not so stressed out all the time.
Mm-hmm. My daughter, she has some variants for celiac, and I just kept her off gluten and dairy to begin with. It's just so much easier. But we would let her have gluten or dairy every so often, and then we were just in New Orleans, and she was having quite a bit of gluten, and she used to get these little sores, and she's like, Mommy, I think I'm healed. I think I can just have gluten. Well, we do this once a year, let your body see it, and then we're kind of done, overindulge. Well, speaking of diet, my understanding is at one point you were vegan, and now you're more paleo. I don't know. Can you sort of walk us through your own personal experience? And this is coming from someone who was a vegetarian for 27 years. That was me. So just, how has that evolves for you? And then what does that mean in terms of what you are, teaching to your patients and recommending to your patients?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I knew that about you too. I remember one of the first times we met was back in the day. It was I met you before this, but I remember going to the first Mind Body Green Revitalize. It was like in Tucson. That was a good year, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was. It was fun.
That's a fun event. Anyways, derailed. But the vegan, So I was always very interested in health and wellness. I was a weird, health science kid. I'd use all my paychecks at the finish line. I worked at the finish line selling shoes in high school, and I wasn't that good at the job. I guess I was pretty good. What can I say? But I'd use my paychecks to go to the health food co-op and like buy the latest superfoods and supplements and like biohack before it was even like, it was no word for biohacking then, but it was just experimentation on like, how can I level up how I felt as a 16-year-old? So around that time, not at 16, but in my late 17, 18, I really became vegan again without even being like labeling. I didn't really do it from like much of a reason other than me experimenting with food and how it made me feel. And I was whole foods vegan. It wasn't like processed junk food. And really a lot of the time, the information at that time and the science at that time was experimenting with this sort of whole foods based approach that was plant-based. And it made me feel good too. So it was like, really, it worked for me. And then over the course of time, it just didn't work. And I was okay because I wasn't so ideologically like identified with it. I was just doing it from I want to feel good and I wanted to experiment with food as medicine. I pivoted from that because I noticed my digestion wasn't working well. My energy wasn't working well. I have a double MTHFR gene variant. I have autoimmune conditions on both sides of my family. So in hindsight, like it makes complete sense clinically. But I was also being trained in functional medicine around that time too. So it was me sort of evolving out of that. I wrote that journey in Ketotarian, which is my first book, that is sort of I would say a Mediterranean way of doing the ketogenic diet that talks about clean carb cycling and not fearing carbs, but how can we use the science of ketosis in a way to enhance brain function and metabolic health. Anyway, so that was that book. And it's lots of, wild caught fish and healthy plant-based fats like extra virgin olive oil and avocados and fiber-rich vegetables. So that's kind of my story was in Ketotarian. But as a clinician, if you're like taking off my own personal journey, hat off, and as a clinician, I'm not really at all a tribal in the way that like I'm saying like this is the one way for everybody. Because as you see somebody, if you see someone for a living, or if you are somebody that sees people with different types of autoimmune conditions and different metabolic and hormonal problems throughout the day, you cannot hang your hat on like exactly one prescriptive food. You'd be proven wrong all day long. Because again, there's a science and art. Like if somebody hates the way that they're eating, that stress and anxiety around the food will create a different result. So you have to be a pragmatist. You have to be open-minded. You have to be artistic in how you use food as medicine, but also clinical, like what's relevant. So sometimes like plan A makes sense on paper for a patient, but they hate what they're eating. They have so much inner resistance towards it. So you have to be pragmatic and like curating a plan B. And sometimes plan B is more effective than plan A because the person loves the food that they're eating. And that sort of relationship they have with food creates a completely different result. So back to that gut feelings crosstalk, if you will. Yeah, so that's kind of my take. I clinically have patients on carnivore protocols. I have patients on fully plant-based protocols based on clinical reasons and personal preferences. We know clinically, there's some people for religious reasons or ethical reasons, they want to be exclusively plant-based or predominantly plant-based. So as a clinician, yes, I can say, well, in theory, an omnivore approach would make more sense here, but there's some people that just can't do that or won't do that. So you have to meet them where they're at. And as a pragmatist, clinically, I can get them in a great place without pushing a square peg through a round hole. So that's kind of my take on it. I'm kind of agnostic when it comes to like one way of eating. It's just, well, what's the right way for you that moves the needle as far as labs and how you feel?
Yeah, I'm so glad you're saying that. Years ago when I hosted the Autoimmune Summit, I had asked Dr. Joel Fuhrman to be a guest, and he's, I believe, at least vegan. I'm vegetarian, if not vegan. And he said, I can't be on the summit because, I don't believe in that way. And I said, well, I think my listeners would really love to hear this because, I could tell you that I'm healing a lot of people on a paleo type diet, but you are clearly, healing people with autoimmunity on this plant-based diet. And I think it'd be just so helpful, to hear different points of view. And he just didn't want anything to do with it. Like he did not want to be associated. And I think, that causes so many problems for people when it has to be this way or that. And now as I'm, exploring things in the cancer world, I do believe cancer is a metabolic disease, and Naisha Winter's work and previous people that is really solid. But there are plenty of places. In fact, we were trying to find a place for my sister to maybe go inpatient somewhere. And many of those places are raw vegan, and they are getting results. So, I mean, it's just, I always say there's like 1,000 ways to skin a cat. And so a lot of, hearing particularly about, if you're having to do this thing, even though maybe you and I have seen with 100 patients or even 1,000 patients that works, but if that person is sitting there miserable trying to eat that steak, it's not going to do any good for them if they're just having all these negative hormones raging through their body as they're trying to eat this healthy grass-fed steak, right?
Yeah, right. And it's a personal thing. And what I have found is interesting is once people start to feel better, but they feel like, then they get to the point where, oh no, I could feel even better. And then sometimes they're open to bringing, maybe they're vegan and maybe they're open to being pescatarian or vegetarian. And it's like, they trust you whenever you see results. But they're not even trusting you. They're trusting their body.
Right.
And they're noticing, hey, oh no, my body is feeling better. And they want to do the things that are loving them back more because they're encouraged by it. So I think a lot of, it's so easy to be super tribal and super ideological. And this applies to food and to politics and lots of other things. when you only know one way. But when you know, okay, there's other ways, there's so much nuance and context and diversity, and not to be afraid of that, but really to welcome it and to find out what works for you. And I would say the caveat, the second part to that is what works for you right now. Because what works for you right now, your microbiome is always changing. Your life circumstances are always changing. So not becoming overly identified as like, this is my identity, no matter what it is. Because even if you look, let's just look at the guys that you and I know, great guys that are like super staunch carnivores, they would tell you a couple of years ago, they wouldn't have had anything other than meat. And now those same guys that I care for a lot are now eating tons of fruit and meat and tons of honey. So like even they're evolving and they live and breathe this stuff. So it's okay to say, okay, pivot and evolve. What works for you once at one season of your life may not always work for you for the rest of your life. And that's part of being human, is change and evolve and learning and doing better.
When we were at that Mind Body Green event together, there was a very well-known vegan there, or at least vegetarian. And I was having dinner and had this conversation about, they were eating a lot of processed foods and then, became vegan or vegetarian and felt a lot better. I said, well, have you ever thought about adding in meat? Because you might feel even better, because a lot of people, it's one thing if you're eating meat and eating a really clean diet and then you switch to vegetarian and you feel better. Okay, that's some data. But if you're eating junk and then you switch to real whole foods with or without meat, you kind of don't know what it is. And they said to me, oh, I can't do that now. I mean, this is like my whole platform, right? Like I can't. So, pigeonholing yourself. I mean, I think it's good to be open-minded, as the two of us are. Like a lot of things make the world go round. And really this person, I don't know, because this was however many years ago, 10 years ago that we were at that conference. So, I don't know what they're doing, but just the whole idea that it was like, oh no, I can't do that. This is like my entire platform now is that I've pigeonholed myself into this thing. And it's like, wow. I mean, I would hope and think that your followers and community would, evolve with you. And like when you admit that like, hey, there could be another way to do something, but.
Yeah. Well, I have two very fascinating, if people want the tea on vegans, but because it becomes, it's very almost religious, right? It's like leaving a religion and then the zealots will get mad at you. I've seen it time and time again at one of the same events. If it wasn't that event, it was the year after, a very prominent, again, vegan athlete said the same thing. He said, well, if I had his words to me were, if I had my take, I'd probably eat paleo, but my followers and my wife would never accept that.
Okay, I think we're literally talking about the same person.
Okay, you must be telling. Yeah. So I don't get, but I'm looking at this with telehealth patients, massive followings online they were vegan, their identity was vegan, and they were patients of mine, they could never have shared the fact that they were not vegan anymore. And then when they decided to share, some of them decided, some of them didn't, they got so much backlash from the vegan community. It was as if again, this is what it is. Because when you equate it with murder, they see it as murder. So you might as well have been Jeffrey Dahmer in their mind, because that's where they're coming from. That's their worldview. So yeah, that's why people don't want to come out of the omnivore closet when you're a vegan, because they get treated horribly.
Yeah. Well, we, always joke that there were not, when I comments on blogs and stuff in the early days, that there just weren't a lot of vegans following me, but they were just very loud, the ones that were, right? Yeah, I mean, that's, anybody with anything negative. And again, nothing towards vegans. I personally have been a vegan for a period of my life, and I was a vegetarian for 27 years. So I want to
no, you do it. Yeah. That can happen. Let me be clear. That can happen with any way of eating.
Yeah, right. Yes.
You make it your religion, because the keto people can be like that. The carnivore people can be like that. When you're overly zealous about that thing, it's not just vegans, it's anybody. So it's just, we need to be okay with realizing to not make food your identity, I think.
Right. Or anything, I think we can, as you started off this part of the conversation, I think it's in any area of life, right? I mean, when people are just, intolerant of others. So
Right, exactly.
And, so much diversity makes this world go round. Well,
Yeah.
an area that I kind of want to jump into is something that I think has been getting a lot more attention, particularly when it comes to inflammation and autoimmunity, is trauma and the role of trauma, particularly in those with autoimmunity. You've mentioned it and kind of alluded to it. So what are you doing to, I guess, ask about, underlying traumas for people? And then, so how are you uncovering these? And then, how are you helping people process these, whether it's, in your office or outside services, or, what are you doing and what are you seeing? Because also I just think the research it's been there, but it's coming out more and more, with the ACE score and whatnot. And then, I think there are just more traumas in the world, right? I mean, some people could, say last night is a trauma for them, no matter who is going to win that election, to all of these natural disasters and people losing homes, or, it's just, there's a lot of trauma in the world right now. So what are you doing on that topic?
Yeah, that's really what my latest, my most recent book called Gut Feelings was all about. It was those conversations, like each book was born out of a lot of conversations with telehealth patients and knowing, okay, I wanted to have a conversation outside of that consult with people that, readers. And Gut Feelings is about that, dealing with the gut and the feelings, the mental, emotional, spiritual stuff. How does that impact physiology and the research around autoimmunity? When you look at the physiological event of molecular mimicry, when the immune system's attacking parts of the body with autoimmunity, well, that's happening obviously on a physical level. But then you think of how the researchers even referred to molecular mimicry, this case of mistaken identity with autoimmunity. They use the phrase, I've seen the phrase said, the immune system's lost recognition of self. And I think, wow, that's deep if you think about the research around chronic stress and unresolved trauma and high ACE scores, and how do these things, like what beget what, like what came first here? And for some people, I would say for most people, it's a bit of both. There's physiological factors like there's environmental toxins that we mentioned and microbiome health. But we cannot ignore the feeling side of that gut feelings crosstalk. And for some people, the feeling side is actually the bigger piece of the puzzle. And that's what triggered a lot of issues. So on a clinical level, we have every telehealth patient fill out an ACE questionnaire. Yeah. It's adverse childhood events or experiences, but it's talking, this, but for people that don't know, really serious, heavy stuff to be asking somebody when you first meet them online. We're talking about sexual trauma and physical abuse growing up, neglect growing up, substance abuse growing up. And the research is clear that the higher one's ACE score, the more likely that that's a component to things like autoimmune conditions, metabolic issues, but of course, mental health issues like anxiety and depression and other chronic health problems. So it's a piece of the conversation. It's not the entire conversation, but it's a piece of it. And how I put a lot of practices in that book that I've seen success with, but different somatic practices, breath work, meditation. I see therapy practices like EMDR being very helpful. I see microdosing psilocybin when it's appropriate being very helpful with these somatic practices and getting their gut healthy. So I see a lot of things that are either emerging in the scientific literature or just tried and true, like supportive. And another area that's in sort of, I would say, the tech space are these wearable vagal nerve stimulators. I've seen good, like almost adjunctive supportive tools. I wouldn't say that they can't be the only tool you're relying on, but they are definitely needle movers, because I have patients that do good things for their body, but they're stuck at a plateau. But there's devices like Sensate and Apollo Neuro that are doing really innovative things that, paired with breath work and meditation and these other practices we're talking about, really can be congruent to supporting that parasympathetic. Because a lot of these people that we're talking to have poor vagal tone, that vagus nerve, that part of their parasympathetic, that resting, digesting aspect of their nervous system is weak. So getting the gut healthy, all the nutritional stuff that we talked earlier is supporting vagal tone. But we have to deal with that feeling side as well to support vagal tone as well, to metabolize things like stored trauma, to modulate and improve the body's resilience to current chronic stress as well, to support that brain adrenal axis. So that's kind of my take on it. It's not just one thing. A big caveat is I threw out a lot of stuff there. You don't need all the stuff. We just need like a handful, 1, 2, 3 effective tools that you can be consistent with. So that's part of the art part of it all too, is that like, all right, what do you love that also loves you back? Mm-hmm. And if you hate what loves you back, that's not good. So we want to find the things that you really enjoy so you can stay consistent with it and that also nourishes you. So it's finding that perfect key and lock scenario for all of these tools for people.
Right. Well, that's a great segue into the question that I usually like to ask my guests before we part ways is, what are 3 ways that the listeners can take back their health?
Number 1, well, I would say number 1, just don't stress so much, right? So sometimes it's unfollowing people on social media that maybe are informative, maybe great for other people, but for you and your journey right now, like consuming all this information, like humans were not designed to take in everybody's day-to-day life highlight reel all day, every day. So maybe it's unfollowing, maybe it's having time limits on apps, maybe it's having time limits on your phone. It's like healthy boundaries is something that's good in measured doses, but like not all consuming. Because I call it JOMO, the joy of missing out. It's like the antithesis to FOMO culture, because there's a lot of FOMO-inducing, fear of missing out inducing content online that we have to look at what we're serving, not just our body with breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but what are we serving our head and our heart on a daily basis, and the content we're consuming on a daily basis. So I would say, look at that stress component. Number 2, I'm a fan of some soups and stews, right? Like the easy to digest, like a proverbial siesta for a stressed out gut and inflammation is like making some good bone broth, hearty stews, especially this time of year, like the cold months. It's a great way to get cozy and comfy and get a good, nourishing, hearty stew. And like pick your favorite vegetables and proteins and make it easy to digest. It kind of makes it almost pre-digests it in a way by having the meat very soft, the vegetables very soft. You can even puree it. And fruit, you can even cook the fruit down to like make it like a compote, like an inside of a pie without a pie, and have that as a little dessert, drizzle some Manuka honey on it. So I think like focusing on these nourishing, gut-friendly ways of preparing food would be number 2. And number 3, I would say get out in nature. Like the research out of Japan and South Korea of Shinrin-yoku, of forest bathing. I love that. Like nature is a medicine and nature is a meditation. So to really lean into this, and even like my telehealth clinic is not I live in the forest, but my clinic here is not in the forest. So we have this tiny little patch of grass, and every day my telehealth team and I go and sit in this tiny little patch, like right on the road, and sit on that grass under this one little tree. And if that's all you have, like that's all your body needs. There's research that shows even pictures of nature will modulate your biochemistry in a positive way. So you don't need to be like out in the country, even though that is hugely medicinal, as you and I both know. But if you don't have access to that, just get the green space you have.
Yeah. I, as you know, have another home in the desert, and my one requirement was, I don't know how big it is, but it's not very big, a piece of lawn. So we have a 10,000 gallon cistern that collects rainwater and snow and all this stuff. But I have one little patch of grass that, well, there's snow on it right now. But I usually get up, walk out with the dogs, ground myself on the grass, look up at the sun, and, try to start my day that way. So I hear you about, no matter how small the patch of grass or a little bit of nature is, do what you can to get that in.
And I would say, doesn't matter how, I live in the Northeast. It doesn't matter how cold or how rainy or how snowy it is either. Like Canadians have taught me a lot of things in my life because they're some of God's nicest people. But they've also said they've told me, telehealth patients have told me that there's no such thing as bad weather. There's just improper clothing. So get out in nature, bundle up, wear a raincoat, quit complaining, get out and do it.
Yeah.
So there's no excuse.
No, I love that. I've lived in Seattle for a while, and it's the perfect scenario of it just like constantly drizzly, and you just see people walking around the lake and biking and everything. And I was having a party the other day, a Halloween party, and one of the moms, I was like, "Oh my God, it's supposed to rain." She's like, "Don't worry, we're from England. We're used to it. We'll be there. We'll be outside." I mean, it was pouring.
It's funny.
So
I was in England recently, and that's something that I noticed. It's so different than the States. It was raining and full on raining. People were walking their dogs.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's it.
Yeah.
Like, what are you waiting for? Like, just go and live your life.
Right. Yeah. No, because there is these days no perfect weather.
Yeah.
Well, this was so fun to catch up. Could you tell our listeners who are not familiar with you where they can find you?
Yeah, thank you so much. This is great. So everything's at drwillcole.com. That's drwillcole.com. My podcast is called The Art of Being Well. You were on it. Thank you so much. And come back anytime. So yeah, Art of Being Well, drwillcole.com.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This was awesome. It was good to connect. And thanks for playing along and going rogue with me there in the beginning. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I love it. No, it was great.
I want to thank this week's guests for sharing their time and knowledge, and thank you for listening. To read the full show notes for each episode, which include a summary, timestamp, quotes, and any resources mentioned, please visit amymyersmd.com/podcast. Lastly, if you've enjoyed this episode, I'd love if you would leave a rating and a review on Apple or Spotify, and we'll select a few to read out loud in a future episode. Tune in next week to hear from another inspiring guest as we help you take back your health.